Yeah. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the September Walk Massachusetts monthly network meeting. My name is Althea Weinborn, and I'm co-executive director for Walk Massachusetts. Today, we are joined by an expert on rail trails, Craig Della, who has given well over 1,000, I've heard now 1,200 lectures and authored 5 books, numerous op-eds, and who will be talking today to us about the Mass Central Rail Trail. Without further ado, I am going to turn things over to Craig to introduce himself a little bit more and get things underway. Craig.
Well, thank you, Althea. I was looking forward to this for so long. And when I mentioned that I worked for Rails to Trails Conservancy, I was an organizer for them for 7 years with an office set up in Worcester. And one of the board members here on Walk Massachusetts, ex-Walk Boston, was on my board too. I'll let you mention who she was, Althea. Do you remember her? She's on your board still.
Well, technically, this is all before my time, Greg.
Well, yes, I know that, but she's still on the board. But I'll mention her as we go through this here. Let's see, share screen. Let's find my presentation here. Here it is. And get this going. And let me go to the very beginning, shrink this down, and go to this, go all the way to the beginning. So this is actually going to be doing 3 or 4 presentations in the next few weeks, that this will be sort of like the base of that. This is going to be largely about the Mass Central Rail Trail. And I'm so honored to be here today. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to keep it concise. One of my presentations is going to be in Berlin, Mass, sort of in the middle of the state. And they've got an interesting background on this corridor. And I'll get into that as we go. The Moving Together Conference, I'll be presenting with Alex Garbier, who is our consultant, who did a report about this. But this is about the 40-year journey. People don't have any clue that this is really this long in the tooth. It's very amazing that, yes, it takes 40 years to do a trail. This is from Boston to Northampton. I'm sitting in my real estate office, actually in Northampton right now, in the Florence section of Northampton. And I'm going to connect the dots for you today. Steve Jobs once said, you can't connect the dots by looking forward, only by looking backward. And I'm sort of like Forrest Gump. Yes, some people call me the annoying Rain Man of rail trails, or some people call me nicely the Pied Piper or Johnny Appleseed of rail trails. But I'm really the Forrest Gump of rail trails. I've witnessed iconic events, and I'll talk about some of those as we go through here. And this is going to be talking about 4 separate time frames: the disappointing years, the recruit and recover years, all about the Mass Central Rail Trail. I'm not going to talk about many other trails, just this one. This is the most important one. The tipping point years, the breakthrough, how the idea of a 104-mile long came to be, a trail this long. It's the red line, southernmost red line here from Boston west to Northampton. And this is a more, my graphics person put this together. In 1980, we're going to go through a timeline of this stuff here. In 1980, the State Parks Agency purchased the westernmost end of this corridor, began a 13-year process to build out the trail. Yes, 13 years to build out the trail. Around that time, in the mid-'80s, there was a family, the Fisk family, who walked from Northampton's Union Station to North Station in Boston, and they wrote a never-published manuscript. A copy was given to a top DEM official, kept the copy in his desk, and I was given a copy, and it's very interesting. It's all cursive type. It was on a typewriter, pre-computer days, but very detailed what they found along the way, all the way from Northampton to Boston. And as I said, it was never published. And I did have it online for a while to flush out the family because I was looking for them. Actually hired a private investigator to find them. And they didn't want it online, so I took it down, but I'm working on them to get it published here. In 1993, the Nowatuk Rail Trail opened. That was the westernmost section here. In 1995, the Wachusett Greenways was formed, and they purposely built their section out as a soft surface trail. They did not want to do it as a paved trail. Paved trails are much more complicated, much more expensive. Wachusett Greenways did it as a for a volunteer, and the little rec trail funding programs, they had a volunteer aspect tied to them. And so this was how they built out the trail. That's how they got started. And as I mentioned, they went for shorter segment, volunteer-based projects, and they were successful and without any drama or controversy. The disappointing years in Belchertown and Wayside Rail Trail, the to do in Weston and Belchertown, both in 1997, voted it down. This was astounding. And this was, in fact, became pretty well known nationally that Weston voted down the trail. In 1998, Commonwealth Magazine, sort of like an insider policy magazine, did a little story about this, and they missed some of the points. They weren't really in tune with what the real deal was here, why these communities voted down the trail. And I'm not sure I'll get into a deep dive with you guys today since it was so many years ago, but both projects have been resurrected. Was made in the LA Times, believe it or not. American Farm Bureau back then was the lead to fight rail trails in many places around the country, and the lobbyist for the American Farm Bureau in Massachusetts happened to live in Weston, and that's how the fight started there. Plus, it was a kind of a newfangled idea back in the 90s, and it's easy to get town meeting votes to vote down newfangled ideas. So they went down for a while. Very interesting. All these things, all these little URLs in the bottom, tiny URLs, you're going to have a link to that. That all goes to a 2-page infographic. So you don't have to try to memorize anything here. The amazing thing that DEM hired Jennifer Howard to run a program over 6 months, or a report, and canvass around the state where trails were. And this is the first time a 100-mile trail became talked about, because I think it was because of the Fisk family and the fact that top people like Danny O'Brien, the late Danny O'Brien, knew of the Fisk family adventure across the state, that they cast out the idea that this might be able to be reassembled. And here we are, 2023. Only some of the points in the report have been accomplished, but some of them you'll see. To support research and accurately identify locations of priority corridors, make critical greenway corridors identified in this plan a priority for land acquisition, landowner outreach and funding, develop a competitive grant program, and given the length of this cross-state trail, the 100-mile potential trail, and the complexity of issues surrounding the funding of such an endeavor, it is critical to remain focused and provide support and encouragement to many organizations and efforts forging the way for this trail. Designate the cross-state trails as a statewide initiative and secure key segments for trail use by 2003. Well, here we are, 2023, and we're still reassembling this corridor. I put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Yes, it's all possible. And I'll explain this to you as we get deeper in here. In 1999, Wachusett Greenways held the first Golden Spike event in West Boylston, where Congressman Jim McGovern spoke enthusiastically about the vision of a statewide east-west trail. Our 9th Golden Spike, we don't hold them every year. When I say we, I'm the board chair, president of the Nowatuk Network, and I'll tell a little bit about that. You see our our icon logo there with the spans there of the Nawadok Rail Trail Bridge over the Connecticut River. This is our 9th conference coming up. It'll be in Natick, not on this corridor, but nonetheless in a hotbed of trail development in the Metro West area. But the largest one we ever had was in Waltham during the gubernatorial campaign of 2002, where we had over 400 people there. The Millennial Trails, back in the dying days of the Clinton administration, just before the millennial came in, the Federal Highway Administration told all states they wanted to have a millennial trail for that state and to hold a contest and pick the best one that fits your state's characteristics. And there were 2 entries in Massachusetts, the Bay Circuit Trail and the Nawadok Network. No one had ever heard of the Nawadok Network before. And it was kind of a fluke that they won. And they called me when they won. They said, "What do we do next?" And I said, "You have to form a 501c3 to get the gift of $10,000. And so they set it up and they began to do betterments along the western section of this 100-mile corridor. The Nawadok Trail, the Nawadok Network here did betterments along the way. And then I'll get in a little later on how they circled back to me later, 20 years later. In 1999, I don't know if you realize this, but back in the 90s, when all the wars took place in Massachusetts, Massachusetts was the only place in the United States, the only state that said you had to pave. You had to pave the trails. So many of the places were using the dead railroad as a de facto informal trail. And it became kind of a surprise and a shock and a disappointment when they were told that if you're going to build out the trail, it had to be paved. And so that's where opposition became. In fact, in Belchertown, a woman quit a $60,000 1990s pricing, $60,000 a year job, executive job, to fight the rail trail in Belchertown because that was scheduled to be paved. After I was hired by Rails to Trails Conservancy, here we are. This was the Office on Disabilities and the Architectural Review Board, along with lead investigator from the State Senate Post-Audit and Oversight Committee. I took them on a section of this corridor built out by the Wachusett Greenways just a couple of years earlier on a stone dust trail. And they said, thumbs up, this is very nice. And they wrote the letter that threw the tiller over on the old Mass Highway. And as I mentioned, several to-dos and several suburban places were all caused by the idea that they had to pave. And so here we go. The other thing in 1999 was took a few more years for Mass DOT, Mass Highway to do this, but they did change their design guidebook. And Chapter 11 describes in great detail, if your community wants to do a soft surface trail, you can. And I was there as one of the co-authors of Chapter 11. We made sure that that was not going to be a way for wars to take place. Didn't have to be. In 1998, shortly after the war in Belchertown, one of my battle-hardened veterans said to me, you know, I'm just going to buy this 2 miles of corridor from the B&M Railroad. I'm going to pay $100,000 for it, and I'm going to go shop it around to other local land trusts to buy this from me. I'll sell it to them for a 20% discount. And he went to the local land trust operational at that time, and they said, no, this is too radioactive, too scary. We don't want to do, we only want to do farmlands and forest lands. And so he said to me, what do we do next? I said, you form your own land trust and you stack the board of directors with linear thinking people and not rectangular thinking people. And so that's how the Belchertown Land Trust got started. And over time, they quietly bought corridor where they could, when they could. And that's that. 2 years later, when I watched DOT allow for the sale of a part of this 100-mile corridor, in the community of Hardwick to a adjoining landowner who happened, Betsy Johnson, I know you're big in the Safe Routes to Schools program. Well, here's something a little curlier here. This guy back then was a principal at a high school in the neighboring Central Mass community. He lived next to the dead railroad corridor here, and he had the opportunity to buy the corridor behind his house. So he did. His premise was he wanted to block the ability of children to walk behind his house to get to the new built elementary school. And I said, this is not normal. This is not nice. I'm going to buy all the rest myself. And then I'm going to go and meet my new neighbors who are frothing at the mouth angry that they couldn't buy it. And then I'm going to do high profile press releases to make DOT look bad. The last thing in the world they like to have happen to them is negative publicity. But I had numerous articles written that showed we're going to be buying this corridor, and we're going to sell it to the East Quabbin Land Trust, a linear thinking land trust, to buy me out over the course of the next 2 years. They go into a capital campaign, and then the neighbors, what did they want to see? They did not want to see ATVs on it. I said, your wish is my command, and you will never see that use on this corridor. And so we sold the corridor to them. They started then to rebuild my 3 bridges. Yes, 3 bridges I owned, 2 of which were over water. They have their annual hike every year with scores of people that come out there. This is the last of its type still standing in southern New England that would have been scrapped out had we not done this. And so I teach other land trusts on how to do this. I've helped convert about 6 land trusts in New England and Eastern New York on how to do this work. Then I was biking across the state with a travel writer in 2006 from the New York Times and the Boston Globe. And we came upon in Berlin, Massachusetts, this anomaly. You see, the MBTA, where they own dead railroad, usually the tracks are still in place. And here, the tracks was in place. And this is part of the Wayside section of what's being built out today as the Wayside Rail Trail. But I came upon this way back then, and I took a picture. I said, well, stop, I'm going to take some pictures. And I sent it to the MBTA's privatized, not a normal agency. This is a privatized real estate department. And I said, you can't defend your own land 40 miles out. Look at this theft. And actually I had a meeting with the head of that agency real estate department a year before, and he swore to me almost in blood that they would never, ever allow the sale of corridor to create a driveway, to create frontage, to land in the back. And so they cut out the track to put in a driveway to build this modular house. And so this was the call to action. And when they knew that I knew, they offered up a lease to DCR. Took them only a couple of months to get the lease off the DCR, but it treated DCR like a municipality. That's the little hidden little factoid about internal workings inside state government. There is the state government, and then there's the municipal world, and then never the two shall meet. At least it used to be like that. And in any case, the lease, it took DCR several years to get the lease signed, and I'll tell you about that some other time. But in any case, about 2 years after this house was finished, that person called me to find out why it was taking so long to build the trail by his house, because he wanted to get it built out. Believe it or not, I'm going to next week, I'm going to be talking on Zoom here to the Berlin Planning Board about how we can accelerate the build out of their trail, which not an inch has been created yet, but it's on the cusp. In 2009, more behind the scenes stuff. The rec use statutes, all states in the United States have a recreational use statutes. This now was integrated in that that utility corridors and railroad corridors, if the owners of those land make it available for this recreational use, they would have no liability exposure at all. When this took place with Governor Patrick signing it in 2009, National Grid people were there at the bill signing ceremony. National Grid owns the second amount of dead railroad corridor in Massachusetts. The first one is the MBTA. Collectively, we, the state of Massachusetts, own more miles of dead railroad than any other state in the United States. And I'm not sure if I'm going to get into how that happened yet here today, because I'm going to keep it kind of short. But here it is. This is the rail with trail. This was Rich Davies, when he was the head of Mass DOT. They weren't getting enough rail with trail projects built, so they changed the rules. The rules used to be, unless you can prove it's safe, we're not going to build it. The rules now are, unless you prove it's not safe, we're going to build it. So they flipped it on its side and on its head. They're building more rail with trails now. In 2017, I was called in around that time to take over the Nowatic network. My old friends from the years ago, they were getting older. They accomplished what they set out to do. They wanted to turn it into 501c3 status. I said, no, don't you dare. You can't do that. And it's too hard to get. And I'll come back on board the board of directors as the executive director, the unpaid executive director. And I'll re-expand the board, revamp the board to be all along the entire corridor and not just the little 10 miles that you have out here. And we'll raise the vision. We want to reassemble the entire corridor. We think it can be done now. We think the stars are aligning. Things look like it could be done. So that's what we did. We call it the Nowatic Network now. We help the state do things to ensure that this moves forward. We created an e-newsletter. I was involved back in the mid to late 2000s there. I was involved in 4 wars in Eastern Mass, and 2 of my battle-hardened veterans in 2 wars were getting burned out, and they said they wanted to quit and go and do something less stressful. I said, no, you just don't know what's going on a couple of towns away from you. The newspapers are so balkanized that you don't see what's going on. And so I created this e-newsletter, hired an assistant. I'm a realtor now. I haven't worked for Rails to Trails Conservancy since 2004. And I'm a realtor. I'm the first realtor in the United States specializing in the sale of corridor near houses near dead railroads converted to linear parks. And so I hired an assistant, and we put out a constant contact e-newsletter. Goes out to actually between 12 and 15,000 people a month, including advocates and policymakers in 8 states. And it's simply astounding. It's like I've got a tiger by the tail. It has inspired people to keep going in the wars that were burning people out. I can't imagine giving this up. It's people. I just set off another one yesterday. Some of you I know are on this. If you can always find me if you'd like to get on to this. It's very compelling. All we do is create we have a Google search of every newspaper in the United States, and stuff about rail trails, greenways, rails to trails, bike paths, bikeways. They come to us. The ones that are pertinent to our region get culled and pulled into a newsletter format with a little image, a thumbnail image, a headline, a couple of sentences. And if it's of interest to you, click here to read more. It is simply astounding. It's like sharks coming to chum in the ocean. There's so many people loving this thing. It's when we launch it, we can sit and watch it get hit and expand how many people have. Really compelling. It's really inspiring. Moving ahead, tipping point years. Wachusett Greenways opens the 20th of their 30-mile section of the Mass Central Rail Trail. Belchertown Land Trust donates 5 of the 7, they don't need 5 miles of the corridor, making town-owned sections 7.5 miles of the 9.5 miles total. They're getting grants now to build out their sections. The Conservation Commission began to submit grants in 2018. There's a website set up. There's a friends group now for this. Unbelievable. The tipping point years. After in New York, when the Parks Trails New York created a report about what was the Empire State, the Erie Canal Trail, Buffalo to Albany, what was that producing to the state of New York? Well, the report said, even though it was only 3/4 finished, was producing $250 million a year to the state. This was so astounding to the Governor Cuomo at the time that he commanded DOT to build 400 miles in 4 years. When that directive came out, it was noticed by people all over the country. Charlie Baker's administration noticed it. He saw that what we have here is the densest network of dead steam railroad corridor in North America, within 150 miles of where I'm sitting right now. These are not coal mine branch lines where no one lives. These go right to the heart of southern New England. And in Massachusetts here, Charlie Baker created Mass Trails, the Mass Trails team inside the executive branch, meeting inside the governor's suites of offices twice a month as a startup to break down the silos between these agencies. Not all the silos yet, believe me. I know how things work down there, and they don't have all the agencies who do bad things to prevent trails from getting built. They're not in the trails team yet, but I'm working on it. 2019, ribbon cutting on Weston and Wayland. Yes, Weston voted it down, but guess what? It's built now. And Wayland, they're built. It's under development in Sudbury and Hudson. Clinton, did you know that there's a 1,000-foot tunnel in Clinton? It's forgotten by most people of the 21st century, but that is now undergoing renovations to be part of this corridor. In 2 years, we're going to be at 75 miles open. Right now, we're at 59 miles. Next Thursday, there's another half or 3/4 of a mile opening in Hardwick. In 2 years, we'll be at 75 miles. Right now, we're about 95 miles in protected status. What I mean by that is it's owned by a state agency, a municipality, a linear thinking land trust. And so this thing are we at the tipping point? I think we are. DOT thinks we are, because during the pandemic, they commissioned a report to see if it could actually be reassembled. They had no idea. We know there's a lot of expensive things left to do here. All the, let's call them low-hanging fruit, easy to build things are mostly done. Getting it from 75 miles to 100 miles is going to be complicated. It's expensive, but it begs the question, what would a completed 100-mile trail be worth? So DOT asked me, they said, we're not lifting a finger about doing that report. We want you with Nordic Network to put out a report. So in 2022, I thought about it for a few months. I was reluctant to do this, but we did. We put together this RFP, request for proposals. I think it was a 4-pager, the link on it to here. And it calls out, this is actually mirrored on what happened in New York. The skeleton of this RFP was the one that was done in New York that so stunned the state government that they built what is now called the Empire State Trail. And this led to us. We had, when the RFP went out, we had 4 responses from people that were interested in having their firm create this report. And we chose one of the 4. It was called Kittleson Associates. They're out of Oregon, Portland, Oregon, but they have an office in Boston. They have a sub-consultant, Cambridge Econometrics, not Cambridge, Massachusetts, but Cambridge, England, believe it or not. And they were chosen for their job, and they got underway the last fall. And here we are. They were completed this year, about the end of May. And I knew the metrics that came out here. I knew that we knew that what it was going to say by late February, we knew what the numbers were. And it's simply astounding. It's simply astounding. This thing cost $75,000. We raised the money without much fanfare and quickly. There's a lot of interest in building out projects like this. When this report was done in the spring, formally done, it showed 55 miles open. We've got a few more miles this summer, still about 12 miles under construction. Green equals paved, either asphalt or stone dust. Red equals closed. Blue is public ownership of some sort. The orange or brown is under construction. And so piece by piece, and actually when they were doing the report, they noticed that something very special was about this thing here. It's going to bring us 4 to 5 million users a year. 950,000 plus just in Worcester County. Just in Worcester County. I operate with my lovely bride of 35 years. We operate a bed and breakfast that sits 8 feet from the trail here. I'm going to have to go in, I just know it, into Worcester County and hold Zoom webinars about teaching people how to operate a bed and breakfast. Not an Airbnb. Don't get me started on that. That's not good. I want real traditional bed and breakfast, normal bed and breakfasts that'll cause a renaissance there. 64% of the state's population lives within 10 miles of this. This is unbelievable. There'll be 400,000 to 500,000 overnight visitors a year. There'll be $200 million a year in economic impacts a year, every year. There's nothing else like this. What's next? Well, next thing coming up here is our Golden Spike event in Natick. It's we have capacity for 194 people. As of this morning, we had 68. We will still, with 3 or 4 weeks left, it'll start picking up. We're going to have a great agenda here. Paul Jonaghy, if you didn't know, I think most of you guys know, you're all insiders here. This there's now stood up the Mass Office of Outdoor Recreation. And actually that was done in probably the last week of Charlie Baker's administration. But they did hire someone just this week, Paul Jonaghy, to do that. Yes. Paul Jonaghy is going to be leading the Mass Office of Outdoor Recreation. This is going to be focused on doing things that'll be funding things and bringing things that provide an economic impact to communities. This is our tours that day. If you go to GS 2023, you're going to see all of our tours. Paul Jonaghy, believe it or not, he is still going to be leading our tour. We're going to be breaking out some time for him to speak. We invited the top level from the executive branch. We expect, hope to get the lieutenant governor there. And she's a mayor, former mayor of a gateway city of Salem, where they have a beautiful rail trail. She knows this deal. She knows how important these are for gateway communities. Over the years, we've been giving out Golden Spike plaques to people. Here's Danny O'Brien, ex-DEM and DCR. We have posthumously awarded awards like Eileen Stewart, battle-hardened veteran, the Rail Trail War in Williamsburg, Kate Detweiler, Paul Penfield years ago, Weston. Anyway, be great if you all could come. It's not too far away. It's in beautiful Natick. Here's the URL you want. That goes to a 2-page infographic that has all the hot links to all the things I talked about here today. So I'm done. Hopefully that didn't put you all to sleep, but I'm ready for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Greg. I will go ahead and stop the recording here, and then we'll transition over to the Q&A.